Okay, hello everyone. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. And bear with me just a second here. Okay. Okay. So this week we're going to be talking about poverty and economic inequality. And so to begin with, some terms. When we talk about income, we're talking about earnings that people make in a particular year, earnings from work. So it might be salary, it might be an hourly wage, but income is typically thought of as kind of what you make on an annual basis in terms of income. And you could look at it as after tax or before tax, however you want to slice it. The important distinction is between income and wealth. And wealth includes income plus everything else, all of the value of everything that a person owns. So when we look at income and wealth inequality, we're kind of looking at and trying to measure how this stuff is distributed among the population. So there's a couple of questions that we could pose at the beginning of this lecture. One, is there economic inequality in our society? And I guess for our class, I don't think anybody would say there's not. Safe to say that there definitely is inequality in our society. Another question is what are some ways that we can observe it? Oftentimes you cannot see the inequality unless you dig into some data or do some survey. There's a wealth of data on the census, available on the census, to help people measure income and wealth inequality. And in the last few years, this has been kind of a hot topic, and there's been some pretty good studies documenting the extent of income and wealth inequality in our society. But an important question, I think, here is, should there be inequality? And if so, how much? So, should there be inequality? I think that we would all agree that there should be some. I mean, if we took it to an extreme and everybody made the same salary and everybody had the same amount of wealth, I don't think that would necessarily be a good thing. I don't think it's necessarily something that we would want. So the question is, if there should be some inequality, how much? How much should there be? From the perspective of the economists, and it seems like in this class we often fall back every week on the perspective of the economist, and I think that's important because of the important role of economics in the field of public policy analysis. But if we fall back on the perspective of the economist, inequality is a good thing. Inequality serves as an incentive for people to work hard. And I think on some level that certainly makes sense, and I think we would agree with that. You guys are, here trying to get a degree because you want to advance in the job market and make a decent living, and it certainly serves as an incentive for you to want to work hard and improve, and it seems like in general that's a good thing for society. So the economists would say that inequality is a good thing. So the question, I guess, is if that's true, how much? And again, I think we'd all agree that some is good, but then how much? And oftentimes the economists kind of sweeps that question under the rug as if it's not really important. The important point is, inequality is good. But anyway, I'll move on here. So one of the main ways that inequality researchers measure inequality, not the only way, but one of the main ways, especially when researchers go into the census and gather data, because a lot of the census statistics collects data on income and wealth and puts it into what we call this quantiles. It spreads it out into fifths. So exactly why the census started to do that, I'm not sure why they chose 5 categories, but it's kind of become one standardized way for looking at inequality in income and wealth. So what are we talking about here? So all income, if we're thinking about income and not wealth, thinking about income now, is divided into 5 equal groups from poorest to richest. Okay, so this is kind of a hypothetical here. Each group represents 20% of the population. Okay, so it would maybe be clearer if this were a pie. For some reason, I think people can grasp a pie chart a little clearer. So you've got this, here it's a rectangle, could be a pie, and you're dividing it into 5 equal parts, 20% each. 20 times 5 is 100, right? So 5 equal groups. So if there were perfect equality, then 20% of the families should earn 20% of the income. 40% should earn 40%, and so on. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing, but here, this is what perfect wealth or income inequality would look like. So again, we could measure this using income or wealth. And so if we had perfect equality, let's say in the United States, everybody owned the same amount of wealth, then this is what the distribution would look like. Everybody would have the same. If you took the bottom 20%, there really is no bottom 20% in this scenario. But if you did take, 20% of the population, they would have 20% of the wealth. If you took 2 of these quantiles, 40% of the population, they would have 40% of the wealth. So again, this is kind of a standardized way, not the only way, but one way to measure inequality. Now I presented that first because there was a really important study done by 2 scholars. I think they were from Harvard University, very reputable scholars, very credible scholars. And they did a study that was published a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, in this journal here, Perspectives on Psychological Science. And what they did is they decided to do a huge survey of the US population. And they put together a random sample of the US population that included or controlled for, people with different political perspectives. It had included people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. It included people from different economic backgrounds, wealthy and poor. So it was a random sample that really kind of captured different segments of the American population, with the idea that this would be kind of really representative. And so what they did is they did a survey, and they asked people in the survey a couple of questions. First, they asked them, what do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States is? And they gave them those 5 quantiles and said, take your guess, take a guess, fill in the percentages in these quantiles, and what do you think the distribution of wealth is? Then they asked them a second question. They asked them, what do you think the distribution of wealth should be? Kind of a hypothetical kind of thing, how much should the wealthy have compared to the poor quantiles? And they came up with some really interesting results. And this study was widely cited at the time. And so again, here, we start with perfect wealth equality. Everybody's got the same amount of wealth. There's 20% in each quantile. Now, they asked them, what I had here, they asked the people participating in the survey, what do you believe the distribution of wealth in the United States should be? So this was the hypothetical thing. What do you think it should be? And then they said, okay, fill in the blanks here. Kind of an interesting exercise, one which you could do now if you wanted to just pause this lecture and fill in the blanks and take a guess at what you think, or say what you think the distribution of wealth in the United States should be. And then again, they asked them, what do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States actually is? And you could do the same here if you wanted to pause and fill in the blanks here. What do you think the distribution of wealth in the United States actually is? So this is what they found in their study. Most Americans think the distribution of the wealth in the United States looks like this. So most people think, on average, the people in this survey felt that 3% of the wealth was probably down in that bottom 5th quantile. And then if you took the top quantile, said probably 58% was the guess for the amount of wealth controlled by the top 20% of the US population. And then you can see the other categories here. So that's kind of interesting. So on average, both poor, wealthy, conservative, liberal people thought that it should look something like this. Then on the question, most Americans think the distribution of wealth should be like this. So again, both liberals and conservatives on average thought that it should look like this. So most people thought that the distribution of wealth should be more equal than they believed it actually was. It's kind of interesting. So again, most people, they took their guess, okay, 3% of the wealth is probably owned by the bottom 5%, but they believed it would be fair if it was about 12%. And then going to the top again, most people believed that it was probably around 58%, and they said, it should really be more like 32%. That would be fair. So pretty interesting. Now, when we go to look at what the distribution of wealth actually is, and so they were not told what the distribution of wealth actually is. Again, just a random survey of people who, most people off the top of their heads don't know what the distribution of wealth actually is. And this is what it actually is. If you, look at the research done by researchers who are experts in this field, this is what it is. The bottom 5th have 0.1% of the wealth in the United States. And the top 5th have 84%. So it's really kind of interesting here that most people think that the distribution of wealth is not as bad as it actually is. Most people think that it should be, it should be much fairer as represented in this middle quantile, or this middle part here. And there's a huge kind of disconnect between what the reality actually is and what people kind of think it is and should be. So pretty interesting. These numbers, I think are the most revealing. If we look at the top fifth, actually 84% again of the wealth is owned by the top fifth quantile. And then looking at the bottom ones, that is also very revealing. I found this map or graph online, and it was from the Occupy movement of a few years ago. And you can visually display wealth inequality in a lot of different ways. And this is, I thought, a pretty powerful way of doing it. It looks at, the land mass in the United States, and you can kind of read it here. If land mass were divided like US wealth, 40% would own this red dot there. And if you look at the top percentage, the top 1%, they would own almost, half of America. And so it's kind of an interesting way that reveals the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States. Every year, Forbes magazine lists the top 10 wealthiest Americans. And this is for 2017. I really need to, of course, update it. Most of these folks are still in the top 10. And so you have Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg and some of these folks who have just amassed such amazing wealth in recent decades and have really contributed to this ever increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor. As I mentioned earlier, when we talk about wealth inequality and we're talking about wealth, we're talking about things in addition to income. So those things include stocks and bonds, financial securities, trust, business equity, non-home real estate, for real estate also housing, things that you own are part of your wealth. Some of the more important indicators of wealth or sources of wealth and investment assets are, stocks and bonds and that kind of thing. And the majority of stocks and bonds and these kinds of assets are owned and controlled by the top 10%, especially the top 1% of our society. And so these statistics are pretty revealing. If we just look at stocks and mutual funds, for example, the top 1% of Americans own just about 50% of stocks and mutual funds. If you take the top 10%, that's closer to 90% of the stocks and mutual funds. The top 10% of the US population owns and controls just about 90% of stocks and mutual funds. And if we take the bottom 90%, they own approximately 10 or 11% of stocks and mutual funds. So you can go through the different categories here and look at the distribution and see how it's, skewed towards the top 1 and the top 10%. this is data that was put together by a scholar named Edward Wolff. You can see his name on the bottom here. I think he's an economist or sociologist or something, and he's one of the leading experts on studying wealth inequality. And I mentioned economists. I mean, there are economists out there who are critical of that traditional economic perspective, and in fact, who do think differently in terms of markets and the economy and so on. This chart here shows the share that the top 0.1% of the US population controls in terms of wealth from 1913 to 2012. And so this is pretty interesting. We can see that if we go back as far as 1913, when this data starts, the top 0.1% owned close to 25% of the wealth in the United States. So in some ways, this is not new, the concentration of wealth among the very top of our society. That concentration did tend to decline over time, and it hit kind of a low somewhere in the early 1970s when the top 0.1% had about 7% of the wealth. So that's a significant decline. But since the 1970s, it's been steadily working its way back upward. And by 2013, it was again close to 25%. Now, shifting a little bit here, I wanted to just look at some official numbers on poverty. And this chart here shows the number and the percentage of people who live in poverty in the United States from 1959 to 2015. If we look at the top, and that's probably the better graph to look at, that shows the percentage of the population that falls below the poverty line. If we go back to 1959, 1960, about 22.4% of the US population lived in poverty. And that declined in the 1960s, partly as a result of the kind of Great Society programs of the 1960s that were tried to alleviate poverty. And then it remained relatively steady since then. By 2015, 13.5% of the US population falls below the official poverty level. Now, what defines poverty in the United States? These are the official poverty thresholds. So in the United States, if you are a single individual and you make $13,300 a year in income or less, you are officially classified as poor. And you can see the thresholds for different family sizes here. We go to the far right here of the screen as you're looking at it. For a family of four, if they make $25,926 as an annual income, if they make that or less, they are officially classified as being poor. So when we go back to the table that we just looked at, the poverty rate at the top, the percentage of people who fall in poverty, that's how it's counted by the US Census. We'll talk a little bit more later about how these thresholds came to be, how they determine the amounts of these thresholds. So one of the big questions and one of the big debates in policy analysis is, what are the causes of poverty and economic inequality. There seems to be, in general, three broad theories for explaining poverty and inequality. Those have to do with individual choice. In other words, people who are poor do so because they choose to be poor. There's the cultural poverty theory, which states that poverty in the final analysis is really a result of the culture of particular groups. And the culture of some groups may not place, for example, enough emphasis on a strong work ethic. So it goes back to blaming culture. And then a third explanation is, we could call it social structure. This argument tends to focus on things that are outside of the individual, outside of his or her control. Perhaps like a market failure or something like that. Talk a little bit more about these in this slide here. So when we talk about individual or cultural explanations of poverty, again, we're faulting the individual because they have some kind of different set of cultural values. The theory of the culture of poverty, you may have heard this term, goes back to the 1960s, the 1950s and 1960s. And it goes back to some anthropologists who were studying cultures in Central America, and they came up with this idea of a cultural poverty. That is, there are some people who grow up in such kind of dire situations that there's no emphasis placed on the importance of a strong work ethic. And somehow this argument got borrowed by policymakers in the United States and said, oh, okay, this is how we can explain poverty in the United States. So another idea here from the individual cultural perspective is that, you know, some people seek immediate gratification. They want pleasure now, and they don't want to work for the future and save money and invest in their education and so on. And this is kind of part of a cultural poverty argument. It also involves, as I mentioned, a lack of a work ethic, and in there sometimes is this idea that, oh, people who are poor are somehow biologically inferior as those who are wealthy. So it's, I think, a mix of these kinds of arguments. If you see, for example, if somebody sees a homeless person, I think there is a sentiment among some segments of society that those people are homeless because they either choose to be, or they're somehow, they have some kind of, they're biologically kind of just not, they lack something. They lack something that enables them to work hard and focus and succeed. Now, I just as an aside here, I don't agree with that argument. I'm just kind of throwing these out there as what I think are some of the predominant ways that people and politicians and so on view poverty and inequality. The social structural arguments really emphasize circumstances that are beyond the control of individuals. So, for example, the coronavirus, this is a good example. Somebody's been working hard and the coronavirus comes along, and that person had nothing to do with the coronavirus and so on and so forth, but now he or she loses his job and becomes homeless. So that would be a good social structure kind of argument. But you could apply that to other things. The economy shifts and people are thrown out of work, a variety of other examples. People are the victims of an unequal distribution of wealth. So this is a social structural kind of argument. So if you're born into a family that's poor and the majority of wealth is already held by another segment of society, you're right away at a big disadvantage. Another social structural argument along the similar lines is, people who grow up in poverty or other harsh circumstances, their odds of, finding a job, their odds of becoming the next Bill Gates, or their odds of whatever, are very constrained and limited by their environment. And then finally, another social structural argument could emphasize that, this is kind of a real practical, realistic one, that perhaps people do not possess the skills to get out of poverty. So perhaps there has been a big structural shift in the economy, and now people with certain skill sets can no longer find jobs because there's no jobs in those fields. So they have a tough time finding a job. Let's see, I wanted to also mention a social structure argument that I think is important. If you look at a significant proportion of people who fall into the poverty line, or who fall below the poverty level, I should say, are actually working full time. And so that is not a good social structural argument, that some people have that work ethic, do work hard, yet wages are so low and social benefits, medical care and so on, are so limited for them that it places them in poverty and at a significant disadvantage for getting ahead and so on. So these are just some kind of broad things to think about that I think kind of represent the wide range of debate out there that explains poverty and inequality. And then finally, we'll talk more about some of these, about social welfare policies in class. These are some of the main national social welfare policies that are intended to alleviate economic inequality and poverty. The Earned Income Tax Credit, Medicaid, Medicare, unemployment insurance, progressive taxes, temporary assistance to needy families, food stamps, minimum wages, Social Security. These are the primary ones, and we'll talk more again about kind of social welfare policy in our next class meeting, and some more about these in particular. Okay, I think that's all I have for this lecture, and we will see you guys later. Share.